I work on modeling episodic memory at a neural circuit level. And I wanted to talk about citizen science because I'm really interested into the interactions that can exist between society and science, and especially because I have a really abstract and fundamental research topic, which does not have a direct societal application. So sometimes I wonder, like, okay, why do I do what I do? Because it makes me really interested in. Really interested in it, and I find it. I have curiosity for it, but it's not necessarily the case for everybody in society. And I think it's nice that as scientists we don't remain in a microcosm or like a small community without any public outreach. So I started to answer this first question. So why bother about involving citizens into research? So I put this nice one. Have you noticed this amazing template? I take the opportunity of this more informal meeting for using a nice design that I found, because usually we are asked to use more serious presentations. So I like this one, so I'm happy to use it. So I found this quote from Carl Sagan, who said that we live in a society absolutely dependent on science and technology, and yet have cleverly arranged things so that almost no one understands science and technology, which is a clear prescription for disaster. So I find it on topic. And for me, so I put some images also so I can describe them first. So this, for example, is an example of citizen science. So these are volunteers who are on a small craft, and they are counting the number of breeding cormorants, gulls, and other shorebirds in the area of Boston. So I will describe that. But in general, citizen science is it's a win-win partnership. So it's not necessarily bothering for us, because it can also be beneficial to us as well. So that is an important point between scientists and citizens to answer real-world questions. So we can talk later about using citizen science for more fundamental topics. But usually citizens are involved in problematics with which are societally relevant directly. And the main objectives are to help us as scientists by broadening the scope of research and enhancing the ability to collect data. So it's we see that it's a very powerful way of getting more data and getting more work done in a economical way. And the second objective is obviously education, so public outreach. And so, for example, this is a testimony from a researcher that is involved in many citizen science projects. And on their side, so he says that they are more interested in the educational values than the research results. Oh, no, sorry, he's the deputy director of a funding agency, which is funding some citizen science projects in the US. And sometimes the fundings are not necessarily sent to get scientific results, but also for educational results per se. But we'll see that it's also very useful for us. And so it's not a new practice. Actually, the annual Christmas bird count, which began in 1900, and about 60,000 to 80,000 volunteers now participate in that survey. So, as I said, it's really powerful to collect data. But what is more recent is the increasing number of studies that use citizen scientists and the number of volunteers who are involved in this project. scope of the data they are used to collect. So now they can be using sophisticated equipment and techniques, and even be part of the project beyond the data collection step. So there have been cases in which citizens have been directly involved in the, for example, the publication process. So also the designing protocols, analyzing the data, etc., and even writing publications. So this is more recent. So you can see the increase of publication with the topic citizen science with the European first author across the years. And so the main takeaways from that is that it can be used to improve science, so help us directly with data collection and more at low cost, building trust between citizens and scientists. So as we know with the pandemics, for example, this trust has been challenged a lot. Citizens were divided between those who were trusting scientists, those who were not, who were like afraid of the vaccine, for example. So I think it's this is in great need. And educating citizens, not only about abstract theoretical with abstract theoretical courses like we can have at school, but with actual practice, especially in a world in which science is increasingly technological and specialized. So it's important that we don't let science run away from public understanding, if that makes sense. So yeah. So I'm sorry, I apologize to Fiola because I always every time you ask me to talk at a reproducibility session, I'm always looking for other topics than reproducibility. So I tried to make a link, and I clearly found evidence that these are connected. So I found a paper which analyzed some keywords in publications with a cluster analysis. And jokes aside, this is to show that citizen science really fits within the broader scope of the broader topic of open science, which is also an umbrella for reproducibility. So according to me, it was kind of relevant, and apparently to you too. So that's great. Yes, but it's not that important. But this study is still interesting because it's so it's an automated way of organizing concepts from publications, and they found that there's a cluster which speaks about open science in general. So with topics like reproducibility, but also other topics that we mentioned in previous sessions, like pre-registration, etc. And that citizen science is also concepts related to open science. But we can ask ourselves, is citizen science reproducible? Because most participants who are involved in this project are amateurs who volunteer to assist research because they enjoy taking part in these activities, but they might not be how do you say? Yeah, they are not trained and for doing all the tasks that research scientists carry. So this might be scary to some of us because it might produce data that are unreliable, and we would prefer getting so hiring scientists, graduate students, and etc. But the obvious answer is that it's cheaper, so sometimes free, and also it scales really well because if you communicate well about your project, you are able to get many people involved and collect a lot of data that span a huge temporal and geographical zone. So, and it's clearly cheaper than I mean, it's sad, and I'm all into getting more fundings into science in order to hire people. But obviously, there are limitations which sometimes don't allow us to carry the research with people we pay, and especially in so citizen science projects are usually from the ecological research. So there are many examples. So for example, these students are monitoring a site in Minnesota. So monitoring monarch larva, which I don't know what it is, but kind of larvas. And yeah, okay, I wish. And so it's really helpful for ecological research because typically there are many species to observe, many individuals, etc. And scientists don't have time or money to spend to walk around in nature, and so they have other things to do. So this can be useful in this case. So for example, he is using a mirror attached to a pole to see to count the number of eggs in the nest, and also the chicks of shorebirds. So the question is, can citizen scientists learn to use complex equipment, complex techniques, like we are sometimes using, and collect data that are as accurate, reliable, and usable as those generated by professional researchers? And in fact, if you explain them correctly, if you design the protocol correctly and take citizen scientists into consideration, it can work pretty well. So in the paper I'm directly talking about, so which is this one, they mention a case in which they were so they were trying to identify native crabs versus introduced crabs along the Atlantic coast from New Jersey to Maine, and a student was involved in a citizen science project, but as a researcher, and the data that were that he got from the citizens was as accurate as the one he was having himself. So the citizen scientists nearly always identified the crabs correctly, and even kids got acceptable results, acceptable with standards to publication standards of ecological studies, apparently. So it was even with third graders, so children of like 8 years old, we are collecting data that was usable by researchers. So it's very interesting. So here they position a camera on a tree to take pictures of animals, and they deploy a foul-smelling mix of scents. So obviously there might be errors that are introduced in the data, errors that might be random or systematically biased. And I found a +1 blog post in which the author mentioned some ways of reducing the level of errors. So one way is to provide clarifying metadata or to register uncertainty. So because citizen science as a field is really maturing, but at the beginning, for example, it was not clear what kind of data citizens were asked to collect. So instead of giving numbers, they were giving like quantities such as like a lot or some not precise numbers. So for example, to be precise with the kind of data you expect is important. So to make this clear and explicit, and a good way is to allow them to report their uncertainty about the value they measure. Another way is to use incentives to reduce bias. So for example, there can be a motivation system. But in fact, with the examples that I will mention later, you will notice that what I'm talking about here is like the prehistorical age of citizen science. But nowadays, it's more, many projects use gamification to collect data. So for example, there are games that are developed. So citizens actually play games, video games, and this video game experience is a process of scientific research. So this is a kind of incentive that can be used. And also there's a need for assessing the accuracy of contributed data with, for example, studies that try to compare data collected from citizen science projects and data collected by professional scientists. I found this textbook, if you are interested in citizen science, which just came out about the science of citizen science. And so they identified 4 ways in which the data errors could be introduced into the data. So I won't enter into the details, but that can be interesting. But there is a study that tries to compare what I said. So data from professional scientists and data from citizens. And they found that the percent agreement between citizen science data and reference data was, I mean, I don't know how to qualify this, if you think it's good or not. But for example, if you compare to real research and how there was a reproducibility crisis, for example, you might say that so almost 50% of studies that are so less than 50% studies that are significantly different than reference data, it's not that bad. So it's a
means half of the data collected is wrong.
so no, it's probably not the data directly, but the conclusions. So for example, they took many studies that use citizen science and reference studies that use professional scientists to collect the data, and it's probably about the conclusions they get. So there are a bit less than 50% of studies that show a conclusion that differs from the reference study. But in fact, if you check the reproductions of studies, I don't remember the reproduction rate on average. It depends on the field, but but
from what I remember from the Nature paper, for example, the one that sort of like really triggered the conversation about the reproducibility crisis, it's almost 50%. Some fields is even up to 80% they cannot reproduce.
Okay. Because at first when I was reading that, I was having your reaction as well, but then I've
science to science.
Yeah, so it's not aberrant to me.
Psychology was really hard at some
point.
Yeah.
But this is probably in ecological research. I'm not sure. So it's definitely a question. So whether the data collected is accurate or not. However, it's very hard to assess apparently. So they discuss that in the textbook, and there have been some very successful examples of citizen science I will mention later. Yeah, a very good impact of citizen science. All right. but I think it must be evaluated on a case by case basis. Yeah. So I talked a lot about the theory, but now I'm going to show some examples, and especially examples that are closer to the fields we are working in. So for those who work in AI, you might know reCAPTCHA. So probably everybody knows what a CAPTCHA is. So it's to assess whether you are a bot or not. And this can be characterized as a citizen science project, because before it was sold to Google, it was actually developed by a researcher in order to help book digitization. And so in order to show that you are not a bot, you were asked to say the word that was written on an image. So here it was about crowdsourcing image labels, and later we know that this technology was bought by Google and used to label, for example, the house numbers on a Street View, Google Street View. So you were shown a number and asked to type it. And this was later criticized because the difference with citizen science is that citizens were not voluntarily taking part into the research. So they were not conscious of that. And so you can't consider that citizen science because it only goes into one direction. There's not any education that goes from science to the public. Another example from Bordeaux, actually, from the CHU Bordeaux, is an application they developed in order to monitor sleep during the pandemics. So to check whether there was to check how our sleep evolved during the, for example, lockdown. And so I haven't used it myself, but I think people were self-reporting their sleeping data, and this was used as data for scientific analysis. Probably the most impressive example is the game Fold It. So here it is a gamification of citizen science. So users were playing a game in which there were like puzzles to solve. So I don't really know. I've never really understood the protein folding problem. But apparently, if you fold the protein in some way, this can be used for developing medicines or treatments. And so, for example, there was a case of solving the primate HIV protein, and so professional researchers struggled to find the solution during more than 10 years. And in only 3 weeks using this platform, the users solved it. And so the 3 users who solved it have written their usernames in a publication that is now very prestigious, because it was both a very hard problem for scientists to solve and a very good example of citizen science. So it has been very popular. There is this example in the neuroscience field, which is called iWire. I don't know if some of you know it. So this one I played a few years ago. You were entering a slice, a 3D visualization of a brain slice, and you were asked to annotate which extents were part of either a neuron or a glial cell. So it was about annotating the human connectome puzzles. So this was also used as a crowdsourcing platform. There is another one for synthetic RNA molecules. And what seems to be the next generation of citizen science games is actually using existing games which already have a big community. So, for example, this is I think a video game that happens in space. So it's called EVE Online, and there is a part in it that was added as a collaboration between researchers and the game developers, and they try to analyze scientific data regarding, I think, exoplanets. So trying to, I don't know the details, but probably to check whether one planet is an exoplanet or not, etc. And this seems to be probably the future of citizen science, because so with gamification there is this incentive which is really strong, and by using already existing games you are leveraging the size of the community that already exists in popular games in order to collect even more data. But the problem I see maybe is that when people are playing games, they are not directly engaged in a learning process, which might be debatable because they are serious games, but maybe you know better than me. I want to do that. But for me, that may be a question, whether people are learning as much by playing than by not playing, but I don't know. But in any case, so I think citizen science really helps science. It's not for fun. It's not only for education. It's not necessarily a bother for us. It can really help us. However, you need to, if you want to do a project with citizen science, you need to carefully design the protocol and make explicit each step and limit the scope of what the citizens can do. So for me, it's the ultimate way for aligning science with societal issues, because so there were many examples of ecological research, because people like to go to the nature and they are concerned about environmental issues, for example. So they might be this might be an incentive per se to align scientific research with citizens' values. It's a good way of educating the public because they directly participate in science. And one point I find interesting is that during a course, for example, at school, you usually learn about facts, but not about how they were discovered. We don't have many history of science, for example. And to me, it's really important to understand epistemology, which is a bad term, but just to say that the process of creating knowledge, to me, it's more important than getting the knowledge itself. To me, the methodology is the most important. And by having citizens participating into research, this way they understand science methodology, and it might improve their scientific thinking and computational thinking. And it helps build trust towards scientists. But it is an evolving art, because apparently it's hard to know whether a project is going to be successful or not, whether the guidelines are going to be followed or not be understood, etc. So voilà, I think that's it.